Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Evershed Sutherland PROPcast. My name is Caroline Andresia, and I am a professional support lawyer to the real estate practice group here at Evershed Sutherland. So our subject today is cybersecurity in the real estate industry, and I am joined by Kelly Holmes, who is a partner and head of strategic contracts. Good morning, Kelly.
Morning, Caroline.
So cybersecurity, a hot topic, a scary topic, isn't it? The world could be taken over by cybersecurity threats, but real estate hasn't traditionally been seen as a sector that's particularly exposed. So why are we vulnerable to cyber threats? What are the weak links that owners and operators of actual real estate should be aware of?
Yes, it really is a hot topic at the moment, Caroline. So over the last couple of years, we've seen multiple high-profile ransomware and cyber attacks on UK businesses. I think real estate is typically not hardened for cybersecurity purposes compared to more obvious core IT systems and data assets. I think if you look at the scale of real estate transactions, they're so significant that the data and cyber elements and the related risks can often be overlooked on an acquisition. So sometimes those risks aren't necessarily properly understood or assessed or quantified, or they might be dealt with or parked to be considered post-completion. And I think this approach is what presents the vulnerability for the real estate sector.
Right.
And that could be through weak links in multiple layers of operator or building management, contracts, obligations, and related security measures and liabilities. So, for example, you might have weak software applied to CCTV cameras and similar surveillance devices that have internet connectivity for remote monitoring. And we really are in an age where criminals and threat actors are becoming bolder, and they're going to be looking for new softer targets because some of their more traditional targets become hardened and more resilient against their threats.
Right. So it's a case really of as buildings get smarter, from the touch card you need to get into the building that then spots that you're getting out of the lift on the third floor and accessing the third floor, that they've got CCTV in the common parts and outside. As buildings get smarter, that gives more ways in for cybersecurity trouble.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think if you think of that internet connectivity, as you say, from the systems that let you into the systems that control the heating and cooling, those smart buildings, there's so many more points that could be accessed. So there are a lot more, access points and vulnerabilities, across the whole estate that need to be considered now. It's not just security on the front door, letting people in and out. It's throughout the entire building that, people could remote access and control certain aspects.
Goodness, Big Brother is watching us. And I don't think this is a new area to think about when buying buildings, isn't it? This is a whole new set of due diligence that has to be done. So how should that cybersecurity factor into DD? And does that DD and that approach to looking at the cybersecurity of the asset you're buying vary depending on the kind of building you're buying, the kind of tenants in it, the kind of use the building is put to?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think when you're looking at due diligence, so when you're looking to buy smart buildings and new real estate assets, I think from a cyber perspective, there are probably three key sort of areas that I would tend to sort of, make sure I've ticked off my list. So I think first of all, you need to identify what the systems are. So what systems are being used to manage the real estate? Do you have an understanding of the robustness of those physical security controls and frameworks? How do they ensure the security of the information technology and the operations technology? So information technology includes like the property management database. So that holds obviously critical data relating to the real estate. So that could be the list of tenants, the financial information, the lease information. So all, critical information is held in that information technology system. And then you've got the operations technology, which is the hardware and software that monitors and controls the equipment, processes, the infrastructure in the building. So as we've touched on, that could include the CCTV, the heating and cooling systems. There could be the Wi-Fi system. So you really need to identify what the systems are, what they're being used for, and how they're being managed. I think the second sort of element of your due diligence, you need to be looking at the compliance of those systems. So do those systems comply with recognized industry standards? So ISO 27001, is the sort of market leading standard. So are they compliant with that? And then also from a more contractual perspective, what contracts do you have in place that relate to those systems? So the system itself, who's accessing the system, what sort of rights and obligations in relation to the system exist, and where are the risks? Where are the gaps? Particularly where there are interfaces between third parties. It's really important to understand sort of how all of those pieces of the jigsaw fit together. I think then from a tenant perspective, obviously those three key steps would apply to all tenants and all types of buildings, but you might have tenants who operate in regulated sectors like financial services. And obviously, if you're in the financial services sector, you have a requirement to ensure security, integrity, resilience, the continuity of your critical functions. So all of those additional factors, depending on who the tenant is, if they're operating in a regulated sector or even in a particular jurisdiction. So we often look at this from a UK portfolio perspective, but clients may have property in multiple jurisdictions, and there might be jurisdictions that have additional requirements. So it really is important to look at sort of the systems, what they are themselves, who the tenants are, and actually what jurisdictions you're operating in.
Goodness, this is a whole new world of due diligence, isn't it? And when you're talking about the systems of a building, that means a great deal of cooperation and integration of due diligence and thought between the lawyers, and not just the real estate lawyers, lawyers like yourself looking at commercial contracts, and those who actually run the buildings, those who are going to, take responsibility for running the building now and who might change and take responsibility for the running of the building after the transaction. That is a whole new area of conversation and investigation and integration of information and expertise there, isn't it? A
Yeah.
whole new area. Mm-hmm.
No, absolutely. The commercial side of it and making sure that you've got sort of information security sort of specialists who are able to review that and understand that and translate that into kind of, an easy output for the board to understand in particular.
Mm.
This is becoming more of a prevalent issue, for at board level now as well. So, and that commercial due diligence alongside the more legal and contractual due diligence. But it's, as you say, it's not just real estate lawyers or commercial lawyers, it's our data lawyers, cyber
Mm.
resilience. All of those pieces need to fit together to get that full understanding of, the potential extent of the risks.
And then if you think about a smart building and the information it collects, that information will then perhaps go through to the owner and operator's own IT systems. And therefore, weak building systems leave you exposed at a sort of enterprise level for the owners and the operators. It's not building by building vulnerability necessarily. Is it a building vulnerability could spread wider?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, across a portfolio, you'll have most likely one system that collects the data for
Mm.
all of the buildings. So, you know, all of that is often linked. So the building management system, may be linked into certain property management systems. How they interface is what's key to all of the security. So the more interfaces you have, particularly with third-party providers as well, the more points of vulnerability you will have across that portfolio.
Okay, so a whole new area of things to look at and investigate and to learn. And then what about backup when it all goes wrong? We're seeing a lot more take up of cyber insurance. Um, why is that for clients? Why is cyber insurance becoming more important for clients, owners, and operators of building? And I do think that sometimes people see insurance as sort of a silver bullet, don't worry, we have insurance on it. So why is it more important? Is it the be all and end all?
So I think it's fair to say we have seen a shift by many clients, particularly in relation to the really large portfolios. So we do a lot
Mhm.
of work with clients who have global portfolios, and they're either taking out the cyber insurance themselves or they require their operators and managers to have in place cyber insurance. And now this is in addition to the basic or limited coverage that might be offered by professional indemnity insurance. And it's becoming more important because it's a means of protecting businesses from the financial impact of cyber incidents. So data breaches, ransomware attacks, and other
Mhm.
cyber crimes. But you're right, I think cyber insurance won't necessarily cover all losses arising from a cyber attack. So, for example, it might not cover regulatory fines or if there are pre-existing vulnerabilities or
Right.
gross negligence. So it's not a substitute for implementing robust and information security resilience measures. You still need to understand your systems. You need to understand the measures you've got in place to protect against cyber attacks. But obviously, it is a useful backup to have, particularly obviously in light of all of those high profile incidences we've seen. I think it's probably also really important to think about the contracts you have in place. So when you're looking at cyber insurance, what you don't want to do is prevent your insurance from exercising their subrogation rights if an incident occurs and they're
Mhm.
paying out. So do have a look at your property facilities management operator contracts to check for any restrictions that could potentially impact those rights of your insurers as well.
Okay, that's interesting, isn't it? To think of not insurance just as standalone, but how it meshes with your contracts running the building. And I should imagine, that's an extra expense, isn't it? Cyber insurance, and probably an ever increasing expense as cyber attacks get more frequent. So you've mentioned there looking at the facilities management, the property management contracts alongside your insurance. So looking at those actual contracts, if I'm an owner of a building and I'm looking to put others in charge and to be responsible for running of my building. What's the market approach on that kind of allocation of cyber risk and liability between the operators and their service providers? Presumably, every owner is trying to offset all responsibilities onto someone else and all liabilities onto someone else to run their building in a secure way.
Yeah, so I think over the last year or so, we are starting to see more examples and a much keener interest in contractual risk allocation and liability provisions and caps and indemnities specifically relating to cybersecurity. I think particularly we are frequently negotiating separate caps for cybersecurity and data
Right.
breaches in those
Hmm.
kind of contracts, so your property and facilities management agreements. And this is all about ensuring appropriate liability cover in the event of a breach, albeit I think what we are seeing is that it represents an allocation of risk. It doesn't
Mm.
necessarily deal with all risk. So you will often see managers and operators are keen to limit their liability to taking reasonable measures
Right.
or all reasonable measures in line with good or best practice to prevent unauthorized access to their systems and unauthorized disclosures. But what they're not doing is guaranteeing that. So
Okay.
a lot of it does come down to kind of, what is appropriate in the market and what's an appropriate level of risk to allocate. And I think what's also important to consider, and we sort of touched on this a little bit earlier, is those interface issues. So depending on how your real estate is managed and how your systems are set up, whether you have your own property management system or whether you're reliant upon the manager's property management system, there will be different interface points between the client system and a third party system.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of the time when we're evaluating cyber risk, we're thinking that the, say, manager system might be the vulnerability, and that might then introduce a vulnerability or malware, say, into the client system or into that property management database. And so that's the risk we tend to discuss and negotiate and put the
Mhm.
protections around. There's also obviously a flip side to that where the client system itself could also be vulnerable to attack. And if it has an interface with the manager's system, then, the risk could flow the other way as well. So I think it really is important to think about the cyber risk sort of holistically in the round. So looking at the client system and the manager's system and those interface points. And there'll be sort of various sort of measures that, the parties can take to, restrict access to certain parts of the system, and
Mhm.
likewise. But when you're looking at those limitations of liability, I think it's also important to consider the client's liability and not just the manager's.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because you would always think that it was the owners sort of protecting themselves against operators' systems, but actually, operators have some skin in this game too against the owner systems, don't they? So these agreements can't all be trying to shift risk and liability one way. The operators have to protect themselves from vulnerabilities in the owner systems.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, because the manager's obviously the one providing the service, I think that's where we traditionally focus. And because
Mm.
obviously they're the ones, doing a lot of the data input, data collection, data processing. So, the bulk of, the risk potentially is there, but actually that doesn't mean the client system is immune from attack and things like that. So I think it is important to be comfortable that the client system is just as robust as well.
Okay, all this to run a property. Right. practical mitigation measures. I mean, obviously, we're lawyers and we're allocating risk and looking at contracts and how it's done. But beyond the kind of legal and insurance protections, what are the practical steps then that real estate owners and operators can just take day to day to reduce cyber attack risk? Because, we can put in measures and contracts to deal with the outcome and the downside and the consequences, but really we don't want this to happen in the first place in our smart building.
Yeah, so I think practical mitigation measures are a real key part to manage that cyber risk. And as we just touched on in relation to liability, you never want to get to the point where you're making a claim or a breach happens. So the steps you can put in place and your third party providers can put in place to actually reduce the risk of, a cyber risk arising is where you want to be. So
Mm,
particularly because there's potentially significant amounts of losses that could be incurred if there's a security breach. So mitigation measures we tend to see are things like staff training.
right.
Are your people trained on how to spot phishing emails?
Mm,
Are
yes.
they trained on how to verify payment instructions? Do they know how to handle client and tenant data in a compliant manner? Not only to comply with things like data protection requirements, but also to make sure that, there's no unauthorized disclosures. Business continuity planning. Do you have a business continuity plan? First
Yeah.
question.
In the first place. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, following the pandemic, a lot of businesses do, but, has it been updated? Does it cover the risks in the current climate? Do your disaster recovery processes have robust backup strategies and instant response plans? You know, all of this needs to be aimed at sort of minimizing any interruption to the operation of your real estate. So,
Hmm.
making sure you've got an up-to-date business continuity plan is really important. Things like software updates. So, ensure your digital ecosystem, so such as your CCTV, all of that has software, up-to-date software in it, regular patching, network segmentation, monitoring. Make sure you're encrypting sensitive data. You've got multi-factor authentication and verification. I think particularly in relation to financial communications, you know, we're now facing sort of challenges that we hadn't seen, previously, like AI deepfakes and voice cloning.
Mm.
So it's really important that, you take those additional security measures. Um, do you have an information security resilience policy? A lot of us work hybrid now.
Sure.
Do you use VPNs, endpoint protection, strong passwords? You know, it's really important that we kind of acknowledge the challenges a hybrid working arrangement creates,
Mm.
and we still maintain the same levels of security and resilience, whether somebody's in the office or working from home. Um, do you have a cybersecurity officer and a data protection officer appointed? It's really important that there are people within the business who have those specified roles, so they can oversee what's going on. They can hear concerns, they can identify areas of weakness and can react accordingly. Um, does your system comply with government and industry standards? So I mentioned sort of industry standards earlier, but we also have things like the National Cybersecurity Centre. They've got their 10 steps to cybersecurity, which is a really helpful starting point in terms of, having a look at your systems. Um, if you've got, say, high risk processes in smart buildings, again, your systems, your CCTV, have you undertaken a data protection impact assessment? Do you know where there's a risk to any personal data that might be collected in that system? And then I think audits, you can't underestimate sort of, how regular audits of your third party service providers, can help to manage and mitigate that risk, as well as regular due diligence. So, when you appoint somebody, before you onboard them as a supplier, you'll undertake a due diligence exercise. But how often do you repeat that due diligence
Mm.
exercise on your suppliers? Something that was true 18 months ago may not be true now, and that in itself might represent a vulnerability. So, a lot of it with your suppliers is about relationships. Keep talking, make sure you've got audits, but also update your due diligence on them as well.
That is a huge long list, isn't it? That's a huge long list of safety work to be done what for a smart building and the people who work in it and what have you. It's become a whole, I mean, the raft of people needed to ensure that all that is done effectively is extensive. And you mentioned audit because, of course, we might put it all in place, but unless you're checking regularly that it's all still happening as it should do, it might all be for naught. So that is an exhaustive and extensive list. It's making me really feel that running a building is far harder work than just opening the door in the morning and switching on the lights. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think
Mm,
that's why it's important for clients and businesses to have specific teams who are
sure.
focused on this area,
Mm,
because it is something which is evolving, and those threats are changing all of the time. So it's not something which you can set up and walk away from. It needs that constant monitoring.
a lot of hard work. Right, last question then. Two thoughts on this. Um, what about lenders? You know, many people buy buildings with lending, and lenders have their own agenda to it. I think they're asking more questions now about cyber resilience with building, and therefore that definitely brings up the profile. If people have to satisfy CPs on questions about cyber resilience, they're going to pay more attention to it. So, what's driving the lender push there? And where do you see that going in the next few years? Is it going to be ever more focus from lenders and the like?
Yeah, so I think we are seeing an increase from lenders in the operational resilience of real estate assets and potential consequences of a security incident and impacts on tenants. I think it's more prevalent in highly regulated sectors, so
Mm,
financial services, all those that involve critical infrastructure, so the data center space. And I think what we're seeing is lenders are more keen to interrogate the robustness of property and facilities management arrangements in particular. They're looking at what the potential risks are under the contract, whether there's an appropriate allocation of risk, whether there's insurance cover, and those mitigation steps we've just discussed. So, if something were to happen, are all of those bits in place to try and mitigate the risks to the operation of that real estate asset, and obviously to the funding they've provided. I think looking forward, I think there will continue to be an increased emphasis on cyber resilience from lenders and, more generally. There's a lot of change in the sector, particularly with the advancements in AI. I think, that is changing on a daily
mm,
basis and new challenges. And obviously, there's separate regulation on AI, but that also needs to keep pace with AI itself. We currently have the Cyber Security and Resilience Bill going through Parliament. And obviously, that has the aim of strengthening the UK's defences against cyber threats, protecting critical infrastructure and aligning with modern standards. And that obviously particularly impacts managed service providers and data centres as well. So, we're going to continue to see more developments in relation to cyber security and resilience. The government has recently urged businesses to sign up to its cyber resilience pledge. So I think it's a really crucial time for all clients to consider, how resilient their information security is and what measures they need to put in place just to stay safe.
mm. And it's interesting, isn't it, from a lender point of view? Two thoughts. One, it must go hugely to value of a building. If there was a cybersecurity incident that meant your building couldn't be used, then the value will plummet, won't it? And worst case scenario is that a lender ends up owning the building or having to find a buyer for it to exercise their power of sale. They really need to know that they have a cyber secure asset to sell. It's in everybody's interest, isn't it, including the lenders?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think when you look at more, say, the critical infrastructure like data centers, one incident could potentially take
Mm,
offline that data center, which not only has impacts for, the customers, but if you think about the types of customers and the hyperscalers that, are tenants in those buildings,
mm,
then, the actual knock-on impact of, an attack on a data center is potentially significant. So,
enormous.
obviously that's
Mm.
why the update to that particular legislation is coming through, but the knock-on effect is so significant, that it's so important to make sure you've got that resilience in the first place.
Right. Thank you very much, Kelly. It's been fascinating. Buildings are buildings, and then buildings are wholly beyond buildings, aren't they? And the cyber security of them is so important. So thank you very much for the answers to the questions today. That has been very useful and interesting. And to everybody who joined us, thank you for listening in. Goodbye.
Thank you.